There was an interesting conversation that started on social media, and I think it was inspired by one of D-Man's videos about the humanization of Godzilla. And just to provide some clarity and context, the comment reads as, and I think this is in response to the MonsterVerse largely. Godzilla's an animal. He's not a character. He's surviving, not having emotional arcs, tired of this BS making him have character arcs. And of course, he doesn't have one. He's a massive territorial reptile that defends it, not a character who cares or is emotional. And then this person goes on to establish, I just don't like how humanized he is and how poorly he's written. He shouldn't be in any more movies with Kong unless they are killing each other. He can have emotions and has, but the MonsterVerse is just bad at conveying it recently. So, I mean, I appreciate that clarification the person provided because I feel like it does provide more explanation for their thought process behind this. But I wanted to say, especially responding to this first comment, Godzilla absolutely is a character. And if you look at any sort of literary scholarly material, many things that define a quality character involve a character having some form of motivation. And the truth is, Godzilla has always had motivation ever since the beginning. I mean, if you think about, very early films like the first Godzilla film, for example, it's even referenced in the film that Godzilla may have like this survival instinct. Of course, it's speculation, but it is like this instinct, like this is a giant animal just simply surviving in a world occupied by other beings, right? And I think that we could extend that conversation across the entire Godzilla franchise. But before I do that, I did want to define a couple of literary terms that I think will help provide some context here. So, the literary terms I want to define are first anthropomorphism, which is the literal attribution of human characteristics or behavior to a god, animal, or object. So these are like direct attribution of human characteristics. So obvious that it feels like a slap in the face. Whereas personification is the attribution of personal nature or human characteristics to something non-human, or the representation of an abstract quality in human form. So essentially, personification tends to be a little bit more of an abstract representation of human characteristic, which I would say probably reflects the original Godzilla the most. Now, I will say though, I feel that Godzilla over the course of the entire franchise has wavered between personification and anthropomorphism. So if we look at the Showa series first, for example, Godzilla goes through a pretty dynamic character arc from films like from Mothra versus Godzilla to like Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, and that is very much manifested in shifting from personification to anthropomorphism in this one particular scene. The scene where Mothra initiates a direct conversation between herself, Rodan, and Godzilla. A conversation that is, of course, translated by Mothra's priestesses, right? And in this conversation, the the discussion had between these characters are very much anthropomorphized because it reflects human behavior, human wording. In fact, it wasn't there a moment where like the Shobijin were like, "Oh, Godzilla, what terrible language you're using," as though like Godzilla is swearing like this grumpy, human like person, like this grumpy human who is just not getting his way, right? Throwing a temper tantrum. I would say, like, at that juncture in the Showa era, Godzilla shifts from personification more so to anthropomorphism, because when we see additional films like Son of Godzilla, Ebera Horror of the Deep, we see films like Godzilla versus Megalon. Godzilla is very much anthropomorphized in a variety of different ways because of the audience shift. Like, the audience at that point in time shifts more so to a younger audience, one could argue. And I would say that's still a character arc. Like Godzilla, in this team experience of joining forces with Rodan and Mothra to defeat Ghidorah, it shows that Godzilla is aware of this bigger world that he exists in and his role in this world. And I think that encountering this territorial threat on the world is very much part of the character arc, right? Now, I feel like when it comes to Godzilla's motivation, because I mean, again, the one sign of a quality character is a character having motivation or intent. Godzilla's intent, even in this instance, in this scene, is territory. He was warring with Rodan over, like, literally existing in the same space. In the natural world, it's well studied that animals do have some sort of emotion, right? They may not have like emotional self-awareness, but they do have emotional reactions to things that range from fight flight instinct to, like wanting to, reproduce, like animals wanting to create community, like animals seeking out pleasure, like especially in mammals. There is a lot of room for animals to, and the conversation about their emotional awareness to a certain extent. Now, I think it definitely can vary. Does Godzilla have emotional awareness? I feel like there could be arguments for Godzilla's emotional awareness, but I don't think it's necessarily the end all be all. I think it would really have to be examined within the context of the particular film that he's in or the particular era of Godzilla. Continuing on regarding anthropomorphism, I feel like the anthropomorphism very much continues in films like Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. Like in this particular scene where Godzilla encounters Shindo again, 50 years later or something to that effect. 40 years later, I can't remember the exact timeline. But Godzilla consciously remembering Shindo and almost in a way like fondly remembering that comfort that he showed. Like that was very much a moment that teetered on anthropomorphism and then shifted back to personification in the sense that, yeah, Godzilla can have these memories, but and he can have like these emotional reactions to things. You can see the emotional reactions in his facial expressions, but at the end of the day, he's aiming for survival, right? So I think that the Godzilla franchise actually does a very interesting job playing between personification and anthropomorphism. We see this again in Godzilla vs. Destroya when Godzilla literally is grieving the death of Junior, right? If anybody watches that scene and does not feel some sort of emotional like response to this character or understand that Godzilla's motivation was keeping his child alive and safe, like that self-preservation, that survival is very much, it's an animalistic characteristic, but it's one that we can relate to through a human lens because we have that same instinct, right? So, continuing on, in the MonsterVerse, I would say the MonsterVerse definitely veers more into the anthropomorphism category, which I think makes a lot of people uncomfortable because I feel like Kong very much brings out the anthropomorphized characteristics in Godzilla because Kong is a primate. And so, for example, like we see scenes in like Godzilla versus Kong where Godzilla literally grins and cackles over physically injuring Kong, right? But if we think about it, Godzilla's motivation is still survival, still territory, right? That suggests motivation. And when they encounter a mutual threat, that in the form of Mechagodzilla, that's when Godzilla makes his transition from realizing, oh, there is a bigger threat here and we have the same intention and motivation. Let's eliminate this threat, right? Kong, I think, definitely made Godzilla realize that, territory isn't the end all be all. And I think that's what makes some people uncomfortable because they don't feel that Godzilla should go from point A to point B and make that realization because he's an animal. I think that we kind of discount Godzilla's intellect sometimes. Godzilla is what? Millions of years old in the MonsterVerse, right? Godzilla has had years and years and years of experience, life, fighting, survival. I feel like it's safe to assess that Godzilla does have some sort of self-awareness in the MonsterVerse, especially, right? I mean, if we look at there's another scene where he is like literally the very presence of Mothra. Like if you look at his facial expression, it calms his facial expression because he recognizes and has an emotional reaction to seeing an ancient symbiotic being that he has cohabitated with for millions of years, right? Another example of anthropomorphism and motivation, seeing his emotional reaction to Kong, like after they successfully defeat Scar King and Shimo in Godzilla X Kong, right? I feel like these are all examples of anthropomorphism. And I feel like the MonsterVerse definitely leans more into the anthropomorphism, whereas the Tohoverse focuses a little bit more so on the personification, because like if we think Godzilla -1, there wasn't a lot of anthropomorphism in Godzilla -1, because I feel like to introduce anthropomorphism, it would showcase and it would kind of like disempower the metaphorical heft to Godzilla's overall meaning, right? Whereas in the MonsterVerse, that isn't part of the equation because that is not Godzilla's represented history in that particular film series. So in conclusion, I would say Godzilla is definitely a character and definitely does have arcs. I think that they can vary, but I do think that they are a reflection of his motivations, because based on the examples that I illustrated, Godzilla does show some varying degrees of emotional awareness and does show varying degrees of motivation, emotional reactions to situations. Godzilla clearly demonstrates decision making periodically, like in the Showa films and even in the Heisei era in the MonsterVerse. Like Godzilla does show some degree of decision making, and I think it's important that we take into consideration that. I think Godzilla is humanized to in the MonsterVerse more so we can connect with Godzilla in a way from a heroic aspect, right? Do I necessarily think it's always good writing? Not necessarily. I like as much as I do love Godzilla X Kong, I do understand that like maybe some of the behaviors and some of the reactions might feel abrasive or forced. But after I watched the entire MonsterVerse in a row, finishing off with Godzilla X Kong, I can clearly see Godzilla's like trajectory with regard to his character arc, his motivation being that survival, right? Sometimes that motivation for survival warrants realizing that we can't always survive alone. And that is why characters like Kong and Mothra elicit a response from him. We see that he still does not like Kong infringing on his territory, but when it comes down to it, he can demonstrate the emotional and decision-making wherewithal to be like, all right, we gotta rally and we gotta survive together, right? So I think this could be an ongoing conversation. I really think that Godzilla is so much more layered and sophisticated than we often give him credit for. So anyway, share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. Click like, and of course, don't forget to check out my show, Growing Up with Godzilla. Anyway, have a good rest of your day.